Well, what I'm going to talk about tonight is something about, climate change and racism. And I'm going to put it in a historical context. And I'm going to read a paragraph from a document which relates to a case in Edinburgh, which is called the Joseph Knight case. And this case was about 250 years ago. The point is that this case is very important because people have said that this case abolished slavery in Scotland. I don't think it did, because Joseph Knight wasn't a slave, he was a servant. But we will leave that for the time being. What I'm going to do is to read a paragraph from that case where the lawyers were trying to justify slavery in the Caribbean. And this is the paragraph, I'll read it. It says, Europeans, particularly the natives of the northern parts, such as Britain, are perfectly incapable of labor in the climates where sugar is produced. A Negro, if not overworked, can toil under the influence of a West India sun without impairing his health or shortening his life. Whereas a native of this country cannot support labor in the same proportion for a month without certain destruction. Now that was written by somebody, a lawyer in Edinburgh, 250 years ago. And it's about climate. It's about the myth and the lie that Black people are framed for slavery. Black people can stand the sun. So that's why we can enslave them without any conscience. And therefore, what we had over 300 years or more is that Black people were taken from Africa, transported to the Caribbean under the law. British law actually said for a Black slave, which was a chattel slave, a slave has no right to life and was property. And we can see that in terms of when the slaves were emancipated in 1834, the government gave 20 million to the slave owners because the slaves were property and they were losing their property. And therefore, we had a slavery where human beings were designated property, beaten to death because they were Black, beaten to death under the myth that a European cannot, in fact, work in the sun. Now, what we have, and I can't go into the details of slavery, but if we look at the consequences of this slavery, what we have is, people planting sugarcane in enormous quantities over hundreds of years. We've got coffee being planted as well. We have cotton being planted as well. And how do we facilitate the production of these crops? We have to take down trees. So trees were cut down in the West Indies so that white people can plant the crops they wanted, for which could be sold for enormous amount of money. So therefore, it was Black lives didn't matter then. Now, what we have is, what effect did that have on the climate or the environment? Over the years, the soil was completely exhausted in terms of its nutrition. What we also have, the water system is affected. And what is interesting is that the original name for Jamaica, where I come from, the Arawak Indians, before Christopher Columbus went there over 500 years ago, the natives called Jamaica Examaica. And what Examaica means is a land of wood and water. A land of wood and water. And what did the slave owners did? They cut down the trees and they damaged the water system. Damage it in such a way that I think I was listening to a program, not long ago, where the Jamaica Prime Minister was talking about setting up a contract in order to improve the water supply. And they were going to put down new pipes. This is the land of wood and water. New pipes, because the pipes left by Britain, in 1962, were rotting. And it was going to cost something like about $25 million US in order to do this. Now, we have this legacy of people being assigned to a climate situation on the basis of their color and also what we call their race. There is no scientific evidence that human beings are different races. The fact is that it's Kant and his colleagues decided that human beings are different races. There is no scientific justification. There's no evidence for this whatsoever. The point is, a lot of people have been killed over that concept. And this must stop. What we also have, if we look now more in general around the world, as opposed to using Jamaica as an example, and I'll finish with Jamaica because as a boy, I remember going to my bed one night as a boy. So we're talking about 70 years ago. And the wind came up and the wind blew. And I looked up and the roof of our house had gone. I was looking at the sky and it was raining. And my aunt came up and said, "Don't get out your bed, boy, because you go out in a hurricane, you will die." In fact, when the trees were removed, the slaves died because their housing condition was so much poorer than the slave owners that they were outside, no trees to protect them. And therefore, I was lucky as a boy at 10. I was in a house, but the roof had gone. And following that, we had polio session after that hurricane, and we didn't go to school for months. So therefore, the removal of our environment because of slavery based on racism put a lot of Caribbean islands in an awful economic position, which we must try and address. We, as I've often said, we cannot change the past, but we have the consequences of poverty. Now, if we look at the world as a whole, I've done a little biology and botany, so I know a little bit about photosynthesis. And what I'd like to say is our food supply is based on the climate. We need the sun. We need water. And we also need carbon dioxide. The irony is plants need carbon dioxide to produce starch and sugar. They need carbon dioxide, but we are producing more carbon dioxide than the trees need to feed us. The point is that this is something we have to manage. We have to manage it because I know a little bit about carbon dioxide. At high concentration, it is a poison. In companies where I know where there's high levels of CO2, they make sure that it goes down on the basement because it is heavier than air. And therefore, this is one of the, I was thinking this morning, an adult standing in CO2 could breathe well, but a child is in the CO2 to a greater degree because it's heavier than air. These are little things we don't think about, but could be important in terms of health of children. Now, if we look in general, CO2 as a whole, 80%, about over 80% of the CO2 that is produced by humans come from the richer countries. Over 80% come from the richer countries. If we also look at CO2 production over the last 100 years, my mother was born in 1916, my late mother was born in 1916. If we look at the CO2 when she was born in 1916, compared to 2020, it's about 100 times greater, the CO2. So somebody who looked after me had a different CO2 level to deal with than I have. And therefore, we cannot pass this on in the next 100 years. That is going to be another 100 times greater. We have to do something now. And as far as I'm concerned, the passage I read at the beginning, it is that passage that killed George Floyd. It is that passage, a passage where white people think that Black people are suited to cut sugarcane, are suited to have poor living conditions, are suited to have a short lifespan, are suited to have COVID. The point is that the circumstances in which Black people live in are produced by white people who do not have a regard for this planet we live in. It's self-serving greed, which must stop. And finally, what I would like to say is that we are one humanity on one planet. And therefore, we are the past of the future. We are the past of the future. And therefore, we have a responsibility to ensure that we do not pass on our greed and avarice. We're producing more CO2 than we should, and that we are taking down trees. And let's face it, without trees, humanity is gone from this planet. Trees keep us alive. And therefore, what I'm hoping, I'm 80 years of age, so the point is that I think for the young people, we have a responsibility to ensure that we pass this environment on in a manner that is respectful and respectful of life, the life of those in the future. Thank you very much.